As you may know, day after tomorrow is Father's Day. And I have long since put to rest and put to bed the conflicts and difficulties in my life going back many, many years, because Father's Day now involves me being with my son and being with my grandchildren. And so at this point, you know, you move on from life. You make mistakes, and hopefully you learn from the mistakes and you do better. The story I'm about to relate to you may allow you to do something today, tomorrow, or Sunday relative to your own father that you should do, even though probably the reasons you don't want to contact your dad may be along the same lines that I had. But let me tell you the story. Many, many years ago in Deer Park, it was Bill Cunningham, Mary Ellen Cunningham, John Cunningham, Bill Cunningham, Billy, that's me, Pat Cunningham, and Mary Diane Redden. 6 of us. And I was typical kid playing in the woods, football, basketball, baseball. But in the house was somewhat very difficult because Dad came in late. He slept a long time in the morning. He went through several jobs. He worked at Procter & Gamble. He worked at Kroger. Worked as a bartender. Worked here, worked there. And, you know, when you're a kid, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, you don't pay much attention to money or about relationships with your mom and dad. You don't understand the dynamic. I was concerned about sports and about girls and about my buddies, Bill Bishop and Jim Willits and Bobby Lake and others, and that was my world. But I knew things weren't good because of the yelling and the screaming. And where have you been? How come you're like this? You lose job, you get money. There were a lot of phone calls. You know, bills aren't being paid. I have no money, literally no money. So it goes on and on like that for several years. And so when you get to be 11, 12, 13, 14, you begin to realize there's a problem. And the problem was alcoholism, serious alcoholism with my father. I knew at some point he was gone. I found out later he was at the Hamilton County Jail. He was locked up for various drunk and disorderly charges and driving under the influence and things of that character. Then one day my mother sat us 4 down, the 4 kids. We were like, I was 13 or 14, and they were like, my older brother was like 16, 17, 13, 10, and like 4 years old, and said, your dad's gone. He's not coming back. And I said to my mom, what do you mean, Mom, he's not coming back? He's not coming back. He was my baseball coach. He was my buddy. We did things together. I had a good relationship with him while that was going on. And as I think, as far as the kids involved, he was fine as a father. He was just a real lousy husband. And of course, you got to be both. You can't be, if you're a husband and a father, the two events kind of bleed together. You know what I'm saying? So I said, well, he'll come back. Well, he left. And at that point, I was in the 8th grade at St. Savior Grade School. And of course, at that point, we were being foreclosed on, and which I didn't understand. And we had no home. In a sense, we were homeless. But we had a very loving, caring aunt named Annette Arlinghouse who lived literally next door. And we spent as much time with Auntie as we spent at our house back and forth constantly. So she said, look, I'll take you all in, and I'll buy a little bigger house on Wicklow Avenue, 8479 Wicklow Avenue in Dillonvale. And we'll all live together. So in that one house was the 5 of us, my mom, the 4 kids, and then her 2 sisters were Auntie and Aunt Dot, and also their mother, who we called Bowie. So there was 8 of us living in a rather small house. All the boys slept in one room, the girls slept in another, and things were peaceful. Things were calm. Things weren't as bad. But money continued to be a major problem because we had no money. St. Vincent de Paul would drop food off and didn't have the right clothes, didn't have the right whatever, and that was part of the deal. Billy Cunningham growing up in Deer Park, that was the deal. You know, you just didn't have it. So I went to Muller my freshman year, discovered several months down the road that tuition was not being paid. My mom was getting nasty letters from her brother Everslage, who was the principal of Muller High School, that Billy can't come back to school unless they pay the tuition. You owe money from a freshman because you're in default. You got to pay sophomore ahead of time. Well, you might as well say, at that point, $500 might have been $5 million. We couldn't pay it, had no money. And my mom was working at the Marriott Hot Shops in the Kenwood Mall. She was making $1.15 an hour, working 50 hours a week. She never weighed 100 pounds, by the way. And my older brother was at Purcell. I was at Muller, and 2 kids at St. Xavier. There was tuition to be paid for that. And none of us had no money, zero. So I got to work doing various things, caddying at Kemble Country Club. Life proceeded. Until one day, my mom said, Billy, you can't go back to Muller High School. And I said, what do you mean? My buddies are there. All my friends are. I'm going back to Muller. I'm quarterback of the football team. I started on the basketball team, baseball. That's what I do. And she said, no, you can't go back. And she showed me a letter from Brother Everslage, who was the principal, saying that Bill Cunningham cannot come back. I said, you got to be kidding me. She said, no, you're not coming back. And I said, I'm going back. She said, you can't go back. So I argued with her, and I left, and I spent several hours away and came back. I felt trapped. I felt, what the hell am I going to do? Because I got to go back to Muller. Well, August comes. It might have been the 1st of September, whenever school started at that point. And I said, Mom, what am I going to do? She said, you're going to walk up to Deer Park High School. You're going to walk up the steps of that building, and you're going to apply to get into Deer Park High School. I said, Mom, will you come with me? She said, no, you're 14 years old. Do it on your own. So I walked up to Deer Park, walked up the steps of Deer Park High School, walked in, and there were kids going thither and fro, and I had no idea what to do. And at that point, Tom Griswold was standing there, and he put his arm around me and said, young man, are you lost? I said, yeah, I'm lost. He said, well, what can I help you with? And I said, my mom says I have to apply. I have to go to school here. And he said, okay, he takes me up to the front desk. I made a Lewis Manning and Helen Williams. Here's, what's your name? I said, Bill Cunningham. And he said, well, where were you in school? And I said, I was at St. Saviour's across the street in Muller. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, we had no money. My mom, we can't pay the tuition. So he did the work to get me admitted to Deer Park High School. 2.5 months into the deal, I have an F in English, an F in history, an F in some other classes. I was social studies. I had straight Fs across the board. I find myself in dummy hall. And in my mind, I didn't want to be in Deer Park High School. We consider that a step down from Muller, needless to say. And I said, I don't belong here. I'm in dummy hall, and I'm going to flunk out. I'm not going to Muller. I'm not going to Deer Park. I'm not doing nothing. At this point, I was 15 years old. And I'm sitting in dummy hall. Somebody had told Tom Griswold at Deer Park that kid is a pretty good basketball player. And so he comes up to me. I'm sitting in dummy hall where the kids that are failing have to go after school. And I couldn't care less. And he said to me, he said, Billy, if I get you out of dummy hall, do you promise to play basketball at Deer Park and don't come back to dummy hall? I said, Coach, I'll do it. I said, I got to get out of here. So I started playing basketball. I was playing a lot anyway, and I never went back to dummy hall. The years roll by. There's a Father's Day story in here. I go to Muskingum College on a basketball ride. I go to Xavier, transfer. I got married, had to come back home, get to Toledo Law School. I'm in my last year at Toledo Law School. I'm 25, 26 years old, and the phone rings. So about 13 years had gone by since I'd seen my father the last time. 13 years go by, and the memories were not good. The phone rings, and it's my father. And he says, Billy, this is your dad. Had not heard his voice in 13 or 14 years. I said, what? Why are you calling me? And he said to me, he said, Billy, I'm dying of liver cancer. And I'm dying of liver cancer. And I'd like to see you before I pass. I said, where are you? He said, Illinois. I said, Illinois? What are you doing there? He said, well, after I left your mom and the kids, I just couldn't take it anymore. I felt like a failure, and I just drove until I ran out of gas, and I stopped, and I made a life in Illinois. And I said, no, I'm not going to come see you. He said, well, why not? I said to him, Dad, you were not a father to me in life, and I will not be a son to you in your death. I'm not coming. But when he was crying, he hung up. I called my mom immediately. I said, Mom, you can't believe he just called me. He said, I know it was your dad. I said, she said, he just called me to get your phone number there in Toledo. And it just clicked to me. My number was 419-281-8677. And what'd you tell him? And Mom said, he really wants to see you. Named after him, your coach, very athletic. He loves you and he wants to see you. I said, Mom, I don't have it. I'm not driving to Illinois to see him. I couldn't care less. To hell with him. She said, well, that's your decision. About a week goes by. He calls me again. Billy, this is your dad. Please come see me. I'm not going to make it much longer. I want to see my son. I said, Father, I said to him, to hell with you. I hung up. About a month later, I get a call from my mom saying, your dad died. I said, well, I'm sorry to hear that, Mom. And I moved on with life. Several years later, Willie's in Kenwood, Willie's in his heyday. There a lot. I'm sitting there. This older gentleman walks up to me. Only time in my life it's ever happened. People often come up to me and say, you know what, I knew your mom. She was great at the hot shops. Carl Linder Jr. and Trey and Craig and all the rest come in there. And a month doesn't go by that somebody didn't come up to me and say, I knew your mom and she was great. I said, I know. Not one time did anyone ever come up to me and say, I was a friend of your father, except this one time. Older guy comes up to me and shakes my hand and says, can I talk to you about your dad? And I looked at him. I said, my dad? I said, have a seat. Introduced himself. He said, I'm going to give you this letter. He gave me a letter. He said, when you go home tonight, read the letter. And I said, what's it about? He said, let me tell you about your dad. And I'm looking at this guy, and he said, I was probably your dad's best friend. I knew him. And he was a great guy. He was funny, good to be with, but he never could shake his alcoholism. He never, ever could shake it. When he was in jail, I would bail him out. You probably didn't know what was going on. I said, I didn't know what was going on. He said to me, do you know why your dad wrestled with alcohol? I said, no. He said, let me tell you why. He was a U.S. Marine. He was at Guadalcanal, and he was at Iwo Jima. And what he had to go through and those battles in the South Pacific as a grunt hitting beaches just destroyed him as a man. And the memories of his buddies getting killed and blown up, he was part of a group that had to take care of 7,000 dead Marines at Iwo Jima and get their bodies, parts of their bodies, and the caskets and body bags and get them on ships. He said it went on for weeks and months and it just destroyed him. And he'd have night flashes and he'd have night terrors. And alcohol to him was medicine. And I said, wow. I said, I didn't know that. He said it was awful. And even though he wanted to be a good father and a good husband, he kept returning to the terror of being a Marine in the South Pacific during World War II. And he would drink and drink and drink as medicine to salve the memories and wash them from his head. I said, wow, I never knew that. He said, yeah, and he really loved you especially. Of all the kids, he said, you looked like him and you acted like him, and he just loved you. And he said, I knew what happened. He contacted me, and he was crying on the phone, saying that my son won't come see me. He said, I'm dying, and he's crying. He said, Billy won't come see me. So at this point, I feel about an inch tall because I felt the guilt of a son who did not know the problems that a father was encountering. And that does not necessarily obscure the fact of what he did, because it's inexcusable to me to have a father leave 4 children financially destitute and simply drive it on a tank of gas until it stopped and never contact us. There was no letters, no birthday gifts, no Christmas gifts. There was nothing for 13, 14 years. And Bill Cunningham's best friend said the reason that happened is he started a new life with a new woman, and she did not want him to have anything to do with his ex-family. Nothing to do. Zero. I said, okay. So I opened the letter, which I still have the letter. And he said, and he laid out, he knew all about my father, the names, the places he worked, the times he went to prison, the times he went to jail, the bad things he had done. But he promised my dad at some point that he would look me up, and simply for him to tell me that my father loved me. And that and the mistake I made was not going to Illinois. If I would have gone to Illinois, I would imagine he would have told me the reasons he did what he did during the living years. He would have told me about Iwo Jima. He would have told me about the horrors he went through as a U.S. Marine. He would have told me about the battles and fights he had with alcohol, which his buddy said to me. He went to AA meetings. There wasn't all this fancy stuff you have today at the Ridge and other great rehabilitation centers. In those days, it was AA, and it wasn't called post-traumatic stress syndrome at that time. It was called shell-shocked, whatever it is. And he never was able to overcome what happened there. So the mistake that I made in my life that I don't want you to make this weekend, go to your father. If there's problems during the living years, generally caused by him and not by you, do not let the living years pass without making that final connection, that final effort to say to your dad, tell me again what happened, and accept his apology. My Christian belief tells me that no matter what the sin or the crime is, it can't be forgiven. I wish I would have gone to him as he was dying to hear what he had to say, and I'm sure accept the apology. So every Father's Day, I think back to what I didn't do, and I don't want you to make the same mistake. Connect with your dad during the living years. Your comment